Hi there. You are listening to the Common Action Forum's monthly podcast, where we look for alternative narratives to shape a better world. The world has plunged into real political havoc recently. The war in Ukraine is unjustifiable, but national and international arenas are no strangers to the ebbs and tides of narrative battles, and this is more so in times of propaganda. Yet, beyond discourses of liberation created and supported for geopolitical purposes, there seems to be a newfound interest in liberation amidst Western societies. I am Tristan Torrejon. It's Monday, the 4th of April. And for this edition, we want to reflect on the meaning of liberation and around the ramifications this war may have for the rest of the world. And for that, we have Dr. Ramzy Baroud here with us. Thank you very much for joining us, Ramzy.
No worries at all, Tristan.
Dr. Ramzy Baroud is a journalist and editor of the Palestine Chronicle and a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. His latest book, co-edited with Dr. Alain Papey, is entitled Our Vision for Liberation: Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. This book is a rich array of Palestinian visions and experiences regarding the past, present and future of their cause. Among some of its most recurring themes is the centrality of language and discourse in nurturing a force of emancipation. So, Ramzy, we could go over a long history of how both the West and Russia have supported liberation narratives to fit their purposes and even justify wars and regime changes, and how they both have smashed them, well, when they were just not convenient. Yet civil society seems more involved now than it's been for years. In this context, how do you see the immediate fortune of the Palestinian cause? Will any of this be somehow beneficial, at least from a civil society standpoint?
Civil society around the world has been in total solidarity with Palestine for years now. We are seeing a very growing movement of pro-Palestine, thanks to the BDS movement, to the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement in the West, but all over the world, that has been, kind of creating a separation between political supports coming from governments and solidarity coming from civil societies throughout the world. The question and the challenge that remains is, will this civil society support be able to eventually affect massive political change at an official government platforms in the West and around the world? So that's what is really troubling. I think what is Ukraine has already taught us, and that is a sad realization, by the way, that the West is really not as liberated as we thought it was. Myself, I have argued for years, and many others, that there are two entities that are in control of the world: the West as one massive superstructure, if we are to borrow Marxist terms, and the rest of the world. But when we see what Washington is doing to press European countries to act against its own best interests in Ukraine and to perpetuate the war and to fan the flames of war in order for them to serve Washington's own agenda at the expense of Europe's agenda, and the fact that we haven't seen a single European kind of revolutionary government that is saying enough is enough, let's form a unique European leadership in order for us to sort out this situation to a degree of fairness, but also the interest of Europe as well. We haven't seen that, which tells me that it turned out that the West is not a West with a capital W as much as it's a West with a small w, a West that is really defined based on the whims and the expectations of Washington. So as a result, I feel like even if civil society reaches the critical mass in their support of Palestine And some argue that they actually have already done so. That is not going to immediately have real influence on the outcomes of Palestinian liberation and will not put the necessary pressure on Israel to relinquish and end its occupation and dismantle its apartheid system, simply because those in power, starting with Washington, then London, then others, haven't really, or they do not really see any sort of interest for them as an outcome of any sort of Palestinian liberation or freedom or justice or even political resolution that is nominally fair and consistent with international law. So yes, civil society support is critical, but the question is it critical on its own if political interests still ally with those in power, as is the case today?
Ramzy, in last year's edition of The Octagon, we reflected on the transformation of liberation narratives, the main argument revolving around whether it would make sense or not to move beyond ideas of national liberation and into a post-national liberation of sorts. We discussed how in the 20th century the concept of nation was instrumental in fighting colonialism, but there are several examples of how it also can be a deeply disruptive force. So things as they are, do you see the world ushering into a new wave of nationalism? Could we foster liberation narratives that go beyond the nation state?
Right. So I do believe that the concept of nationalism, although unique in certain perspective in the modern era, it is something that goes back to the tribal formation of a human society since time immemorial. I mean, if we look at the formation of ancient China, and from the Zhou to the Qin to the Han dynasty, if you look at the Romans, the formation of the Roman Empire and how it started with a very nationalistic drive within the Italian peninsula and how it expanded beyond that, all the way to today's events and the post-World War, the post-Second War events in Europe. It seems that nations go through certain stages of maturity and growth. And you have to go through these stages. You have to go through, you can't skip anything. Because the moment you start skipping stages, like for example, if we are to argue that, well, Palestinians are seeking national liberation, what if we disrupt this process and jump to post-nationalism stage and just assume that everything is going to be, is going to work itself out in the process? I don't think that's going to happen, because that disruption is going to create all sorts of socioeconomic, political, but also cultural repercussions. The very identity of today's Palestinian, whether living in Argentina or living in Palestine or living in Moscow, is situated around the concept of the Palestinian nation. And that concept has its own reasons and of how we feel as Palestinians. I mean, the way I feel as a Palestinian, because my country is under military occupation and my people are suffering under numerous hardship, is different than, say, that of a French citizen feeling very much French and part of a French nation. There are certain historical uniqueness about our collective experience, that of pain and suffering, and that does have its own impact. So we can't really skip that step for Palestinians. Maybe someday, once that identity is satisfied, when we feel like, well, that box of being a nation has fully been checked, and maybe then we can think about other ways in which that identity can overlap with other identities to form, say, economic federations with Jordan or Lebanon or Syria or all of them. I mean, that is something that would have to happen on its own in the future, and I doubt that it's going to be happening anytime soon. I remember every time I visit South Africa, I kind of realize, especially I visit every few years, and the last time I was there was a lot of concern about South African nationalists, that the spirit of liberation that was ignited by the anti-apartheid movement, that was crystallized around the personality of Nelson Mandela and all of that, is being erased simply because the majority of people who are living in South Africa today either were not born or were children, and they have no memory of Nelson Mandela's release from Robben Island and that incredible sense of nationhood that developed around those events in the early 90s. And as a result, they are not really thinking around the same parameters of the past. So there is this debate. On one hand, some people say we need to be conscious of our history. Otherwise, what unifies us as a nation is going to disappear. And on the other hand, we are aware that time, progress, and people move on, and we have to find new markers, new elements for that national identity, maybe not entirely separate from the past, but unique from it. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is every national experience is unique. In Palestine is different than South Africa, and South Africa is different than in Europe. It seems that in Europe, they have already checked that box of nationalism. We have seen what happened when nationalist movements in the early part of the 20th century reached a point of fascism and Nazism and counter-fascism and Nazism. And again, I mean, we can go even delve back to history and say, well, that itself is also an element of colonialism, slavery, and the racism that came with that type of thinking. But since the end of World War II until recently, there has been a sense of nationhood. There's a French person knows that he's French, a British person. Well, Britain is a little bit more tricky. Let's use the example of Spain, for example, or Belgium or Austria and so forth. But that is itself changing. And there's a new form of some people feel that it's time for us to kind of overlap that national identity with a larger European identity, obviously for economic and political and strategic reasons. And that, in my opinion, is what has reignited that new form of nationalism, going back to the past, being true to ourselves, finding the common ground about us as a nation. And obviously, sadly, in the European case, that always leads to some kind of, they always go to a very dark space when they talk about this, because sadly, the history has also taught us that that form of nationalism lead to neo-Nazism, neo-fascism, some forms of dictatorships, and fascism, and in different ways, either in the type of control of information, in the indoctrination of people, and so forth. And sadly, we are actually seeing this. We are experiencing this. It's happening before our own eyes, especially in the Ukraine-Russia war context.
So, structural causes aside, some analysts argue one of the key triggers of the main wave of Arab Springs in 2010 was basic goods inflation, particularly in grain-derived products. With both Russia and Ukraine being key producers, many are warning now of an upcoming global food crisis with unpredictable ramifications. On the other hand, the balance in the global energy supply is shifting rapidly. What other consequences and movements do you see happening, particularly regarding the Middle East?
It's a bit too early to tell, but for sure, this is a very important issue to pay attention to, because we already know that in many countries in the Middle East, there has already been struggle with rising prices, whether energy prices or food prices, because of the disruption in the food supply chain, if you will, that was caused by the pandemic. And they were just barely recovering. And countries like Egypt, they've been kind of batting themselves on the back that, how did a country like Egypt manage to actually survive all of this pressure? And, the leadership there was trying to get some credit as a result of this. And then the war in Ukraine happened. And now the prices are skyrocketing all over again. Now, so I think some of the variables that we have to be looking at is Number one, will they be able to find alternatives to this? Number two, the longevity of this conflict. Will it last long enough that there will be socioeconomic consequences? People maybe are receptive to hardship over the course of a month or two or three, but if this continues over the course of a year or so, then I think we could start seeing upheaval in various Arab countries. And I think the ones that are already kind of at that brink, because of existing political crises within these societies, would include Egypt, would include Tunisia, would include Morocco, would include Lebanon for a fact, and other societies as well, especially those in war-torn Yemen, which have been already struggling under incredible pressures and hardship as a result of the Saudi-led war on that poor country.
And how do you think this will affect Palestine in particular?
You see, the thing about Palestine is all about how do you elucidate your understanding based on what political context. In Palestine, we are struggling against a military occupation and a system of apartheid on the one hand, and against a corrupt Palestinian political elites that benefit directly or indirectly from that military occupation. But they kind of work together, and overcoming one cannot happen without overcoming the other. This is a question that Palestinians have been struggling with for such a long time, and I wrote extensively about this subject, that there are some difficult truths here that we Palestinians must accept, that you can't fight against military occupation while you have a section in your own society that is standing there as an obstacle between you and that military occupation, serving the role of the police officer, policing your everyday behavior and so forth. And if Palestinians rebel against the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli occupation will not allow this to happen. And that's what makes our struggle kind of doubly difficult compared to any other situations. For example, in Egypt, they know their struggle is against a corrupt dictatorship. There is nothing that stands between them and that, except of the military or the police. In our case, it's quite difficult. So I really don't see how that will be manifested. This hardship will manifest itself in terms of the collective behavior of the Palestinians. But on the other hand, I do see in coming weeks and months some change that's happening in Palestinian society that is a continuation of events that transpired last May. You have a new, young generation that is ready to move past the Palestinian Authority, is aware of its collective identity. It's connected from Jerusalem to Gaza, and from Gaza to Haifa, and from Haifa to the Nakab Desert. It's not separated by any sort of mental or psychological obstacles, and it's ready to claim its rights. When will that happen? How will that happen? It's very difficult to tell, and I think it would be ultimately the decision of this young generation in Palestine. So I think that's a whole different thing that we are anticipating because of other events of recent months and years.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ramzy.
Of course, it was my pleasure.
And that's that for this edition. There will be a new edition of CAF's podcast next month. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is caf@commonactionforum.net. I am Tristan Torrejon. This edition was produced by the Common Action Forum team in Madrid. Special thanks to Dr. Ramzy Baroud for joining us today. And overall, thank you for listening. Until next time.